Hi, this is Emily Hardesty, and I'm going to be focusing on migrant and human trafficking crisis enabled by the maritime domain. So some definitions that you're going to need to know are migrant, refugee, stowaway, human trafficking, and SOLAS. According to Human Rights Watch, a migrant is someone living outside the country of origin. A refugee, according to the United Nations, is a person who is outside their country of origin for reasons of fear of persecution, conflict, generalized violence, other circumstances that have disturbed public order. A stowaway is somebody hiding out on a ship. They're usually trying to flee from something. Human trafficking, the Department of Homeland Security has defined it as the use of force, fraud, coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. And then lastly, we had SOLAS. SOLAS stands for Safety of Life at Sea. This was mandated after the Titanic sinking, and it mandates that ships must help migrants on vessels and stowaways. So a little quick migrant crisis overview. I thought looking at the recorded migrant deaths by region would be helpful. Obviously, SOLAS is extremely important looking at this graph. But the Mediterranean is a very dangerous area to try to cross. A lot of people, migrants are coming from Syria and trying to go to Europe. That was probably the most recent migrant crisis that we've had. When it comes to differences between migrant smuggling and human trafficking, there are four main differences. And it comes in the form of consent, exploitation, transnationality, and source of profit. So, migrants, they want to be smuggled into another country that would benefit them. So, the consent is there. In human trafficking, there is no consent, and these people are forced into slavery, and they're exploited. Exploitation doesn't really happen with migrants, and when it comes to transnationality, migrants are mobile. That's the whole point. They want to move. They want to get out of their country. And in doing so, they pay the smugglers, and they are the source of the profit. With human trafficking, transnationality is not necessarily there. So, according to Port Security Center, which cited United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, 42% of people who are trafficked stay within domestic borders, leaving 58% to be mobilized internationally. And then the source of profit comes from the consumers who pay the traffickers for the person. A quick human trafficking overview. It results in modern-day slavery, and there are multiple types of modern-day slavery. You have chattel, you have debt bondage, forced labor, forced marriage, and child slavery. I'm going to focus on forced labor, which is defined as any work to do, or any work made to do under threat. And we see this in multiple areas. We see it all over the world in agriculture, fishing, domestic service, mining, and sexual exploitation. When it comes to human trafficking, 1 in 4 victims is a child. 40.3 million people are slaves. And it's a business. It amounts to $150 billion per year. And it's a low-risk, high-profit business. Only 1 to 2% of traffickers get convicted. And migration is a contributing factor that I'll explain later on in this presentation. I wanted to show the mobilization of human trafficking because many times it follows with the shipping lanes, as you can see. So normally, victims will be taken from, will be trafficked from, less developed countries into more developed countries. So we see a lot of people coming from sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Asia, and they channel through the Middle East into, and they'll go through Europe and eventually North America. So, human trafficking at seaports is an issue, and it's only gotten worse since, the pandemic started earlier this year. So the two types of trafficking that happen at seaports is labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Mariners are the victims of labor trafficking. They'll be on a ship, and once they're out there, a lot of times they will not get paid, or they won't be paid what they promised, things like that. However, mariners are also the consumers fueling the market for sex trafficking. And sex traffickers definitely take advantage of the inconsistencies in maritime law. So there are some mitigation and recommendations that we can talk about here. Seaports should become a stronger checkpoint for human trafficking. I believe it's 90% of all trade goods come in through shipments. With that being said, the volume of goods that filter in through seaports each day makes it extremely difficult to spot the signs of human trafficking. The U.S. Department of Transportation has launched the Transportation Leaders Against Human Trafficking Pledge. So basically, leaders and companies who sign on to that, they vow to train their employees to recognize signs of human trafficking. The Department of Homeland Security also released a report outlining new checkpoint regulations. Properly trained employees are an extremely valuable asset. We have intelligence work going on behind the scenes constantly for human trafficking. However, when people know the signs, and those people are working in the ports and on the vessels each day, you can't replace that. That's extremely valuable. Another recommendation is to build community partnerships and increase awareness on a local level. Everything starts on a local level. A case study that I want to look at is something that happened in the Philippines in 2015. And I didn't know that the Philippines is actually home to 25% of seafarers. So what was going on? A reporter heard about these issues, a reporter from the New York Times, heard about these issues arising in the Philippines and eventually Taiwan and other nations. But there were these scams going on, and the way that the scam would work is that recruiters from illegal companies would go to the rural areas and they would promise really high wages to these rural, usually uneducated men. And the men would sign a contract. It would be an employment contract. However, it was basically a contract to let these companies exploit them. So once they signed the contract, they would go off onto a ship, normally like a tuna longliner, and while they were out on the ship, these men were refused pay, they were beaten, raped, and sometimes even murdered. And their only hope is when they were docked, they were trying to reach out to the Filipino embassy. So vulnerabilities, how migrants are tricked into trafficking. There are 6 contributing factors to modern-day slavery and human trafficking. It's population growth, migration, corruption, absence of critical services and protective organizations, lack of awareness, and discrimination. I'm going to focus on migration because that ties really well into the maritime domain. So, people migrate for multiple reasons, but the largest reason people migrate is usually to find employment. Traffickers prey on migrants because they are far from home, desperate for work, and there's usually a language barrier. Typically, human traffickers trick migrants into a fraudulent work scheme. The migrant believes he or she has found legitimate work, but soon they find themselves forced into labor. The recommendation for that is that mitigation should happen at a state level on a 3-tiered response. Tier 1 is prevention, which includes education and the organization of vulnerable communities, and like understanding their rights. Tier 2 is protection. We have this security-centered approach, but we need to lean more towards a victim-centered approach that focuses on the needs of the victims rather than treating the victims like criminals in a lot of cases. And then the final tier is prosecution, and that's continuing to improve our policies, our law enforcement practices, and most importantly, how to identify victims. The state alone cannot manage a problem as large and as complex as human trafficking. There needs to be a public-private partnership due to the industries involved in the operation of human trafficking. And these industries are legitimate businesses, and their banks and their hotels and their hospitals and social media. That all plays into this. So a current event that I want to focus on when it comes to migrants and human trafficking and the maritime domain happened on October 23rd in 2019. 39 Vietnamese citizens were found dead in a shipping container that was being mobilized by truck. Of these 39 people, 10 happened to be teenagers. The migrants endured a journey that included 2 separate ports, and the container got through security at both ports. At the first port, the port of Zubri, it made it through security under the pretense that it was a container filled with cookies and biscuits. Then it crossed the channel to the port of Perfleet, where it was then transferred to a truck. This was not the only incident that occurred like this in exactly the same spot. In 2000, 60 Chinese migrants were found dead in a container that also filtered through the port of Zubri, and only 2 migrants survived. So looking at this case specifically, and these ports, the vulnerabilities include the number of TEUs that must be inspected. And in the maritime industry, time is money. Inspecting every single container the way it should be inspected would cost the shipping industry an extreme amount of money. And then this happened in the UK, and the geography of the UK plays a role in this. You know, there's 20,000 miles of shoreline with over 120 ports. That is that's a lot to manage. And on top of that, the UK border inspection staff decreased by 30% between 2010 and 2015, and then the lack of physical space also played a role. For future prevention, I would enhance port efficiency so more containers can be checked. You should upgrade the technology, X-ray, CO2 probes, dogs, listening devices, heat sensors. That kind of stops that, this tragedy from happening, and then the increase in manpower of UK border forces. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about stowaways real quick. So how ships are vulnerable for stowaways. A lot of times stowaways are migrants. There's lack of security at the seaport, ships travel worldwide, and stowaways are desperate to leave. There's unsecure anchor ports, CCTV is only as reliable as the employees watching the screen. And the size of the vessel, there's many places that a stowaway can hide. Mitigation and recommendation for that, make sure all ropes and chains are pulled up from port, have an IV access control system. The more lighting, obviously things are more visible, people are more visible, the better. Motion sensor lighting can draw attention to stowaways, manned patrols, CCTV with regular rotations, and a complete routine vulnerability assessments. Thank you for listening to my presentation.